Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to dive into something that has come up quite a few times in the clinic over the last couple of weeks. So oftentimes, inspiration for podcast episodes comes from things that I'm seeing commonly in the clinic. And it's funny, if anybody is a clinician listening to this, you probably know that you often will see things sort of in clusters where it's something you won't talk about or won't see present in the clinic for a time. And then all of a sudden, within like a week or two, you'll see it multiple times. And I don't know why, just always seems to be the way it is. So today, what I want to get into is talking about feet and foot shape, and specifically dancers who are concerned about their arches or potentially lack of arches, or that aesthetic of, that dancer, really high arch, super beautiful pointed foot. And so what I have seen recently in the last few weeks is people coming in and either specifically coming in to look at and address sort of foot shape or foot structure and things like that. So people coming in and saying, I have these flat feet, like what is something I can do about it? And everybody sort of almost like vilifying like a flat foot. Or it's something that's come up almost more in passing, like people who are presenting in the clinic for something different. Maybe it's knee pain, hip pain, whatever it is. And as like a passing comment, they'll just be like, oh, well, I have flat feet, so that's the cause of this, or that is, a problem that's contributing to something else, or things like that, these sort of in passing comments. And partially also this idea of like being unable to change your feet, or it is what it is, or that type of thing. And specifically, I had a parent coming in who has a young dancer. So, sort of like a prepubescent. So like a young dancer coming in, and the parent already saying, oh, well, we're trying to steer her away from ballet because she'll never make it because she has flat feet. And so this idea that, her fate in the dance world is already predetermined by what her anatomy looks like. And that isn't always the case. And so that's what I want to get into today, is talking a little bit about feet, and specifically this idea of, can we change the shape of our foot, or can we, increase our arches or improve our arches and things like that? And more specifically, what I often term as our form versus our function. And so in the medical field, or specifically in physio, we'll talk about form versus function a lot when we're talking about different movement patterns in different areas of the body, but specifically in feet, this becomes like a really big topic of conversation. And so these are not the same thing, and form does not equal function. And that is a really important thing to remember when we're especially looking at the shape of, or like the aesthetics of a foot, and then trying to equate that to function. And so it's this idea in the dance world that like a flat foot cannot be a dance foot, or specifically often like a ballet foot. And that is not necessarily the case. And you'll see what I mean as we get into this. So when we talk about form, we're talking about the actual physical structure. And in this case, it's the physical structure of the feet. And that is complex because our feet are a really complex area of our body. They're one of the most complex areas of our body. Our foot is made up of 26 different bones. And those 26 different bones form 33 different joints in the foot structure. So that's 33 different places where we either can have mobility or stability, or depending on what part of the foot it is. So the form of our foot is quite complex. It's not as simple as, oh, I have a flat foot, or, oh, I have a high arched foot. That's not really as sort of simple as it gets. We, in addition to our 26 bones and 33 joints, we have 3 different arches in our foot. And so dancers are often really, really concerned with what we call, from an anatomical perspective, our medial longitudinal arch. So that's the arch on the inside of our foot, and that's the arch that, like, if you are a dancer or work with dancers, you know what I'm talking about. That's like the instep of the foot, and that's where dancers are like, oh, I want that high, beautiful arch in through that area. But when we actually look at what the sort of like desired aesthetic of a dancer's foot is, it is not just that medial arch that dancers are like striving after. We also have what is called a transverse arch. And so that's an arch that occurs sort of across we'll call it the ball of our foot, for, just ease of people understanding sort of what part of the foot I'm referring to. But if you think about our metatarsal heads, which are the knuckles at the ball of the foot, there is an arch that's created through that part of the foot as well. And this is often a part of the foot that's overlooked, I think, in the dance world. And so when we see these people with these aesthetically really pleasing feet, or people say, oh, I wish my feet looked like so-and-so's, oftentimes they have quite a well-defined, or like a sort of quote-unquote desirable transverse arch. It's not just their medial arch that is creating that like long line and that aesthetic that people desire. So we have our medial arch, we have the transverse arch, and then we also have a lateral, so on the outside of the foot, longitudinal arch as well. And so the foot is actually made up of these 3 arches, not just one arch. But in the dance world, we often become quite preoccupied with this medial arch. And having a really high medial arch is not necessarily as desirable as people think it is. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. So again, the form of our foot is quite complex. We have all these bones, all these joints, 3 different arches that are occurring, and the form of our foot is determined by the interplay of these 3 things. So of those 26 bones, everybody's bones can be slightly different shaped. And so some people might have bones in their midfoot region that are much more like sort of triangular, or like they almost look like little pyramids. And so that's going to potentially create more of a transverse arch versus somebody whose bones are maybe slightly more square shaped, where they may have a flatter transverse arch. So there are certain determinants in our feet that are dictated by our form. And so that can be the plane of the joints or the shape of the bones, and that is going to dictate some of the form in our foot. However, we also then have what we call the function of our foot. And so the function is essentially how the foot is able to interact with the world or create movement or, do its job, essentially. I always like to think of function as like doing its job. And so when we're looking at the foot, the function of the foot is there are multiple functions. And so the first function, or the one we are most familiar with, or we think of as its primary function, is locomotion. So getting us from point A to point B, and that could be walking, it could be running, it could be skipping. In the case of dance, it's often jumping or leaping or things like that. But it's this like getting us from one location to another. So we have locomotion as a function of our foot. Our feet also act as our base of support. And so that is another function of our feet, is to literally just act as our base and provide us sort of stability up into the rest of our body and into the rest of our chain. And that can be a static base of support or a dynamic base of support, depending on what movement or activity that we're doing. Our feet are, another function of them is shock absorption. And that's a really big function of our foot, and really one of the functions that I am most interested in for a dancer is how well does your foot function from a shock absorption point of view? Because when we look at injury, and especially repetitive overuse injuries, and if we're starting to think about things like bone stress injuries and things like that, we want as much shock absorption as we can get, because dance is so repetitive in nature. And so if our foot is not functioning well from a shock absorption point of view, it's potentially going to lead to issues elsewhere in the body. I mean, maybe it leads to issues in the foot and we end up with, bone stress reactions and things like that in the foot, or maybe it leads to problems further up the chain and we end up with shin splints, or we end up with knee pain, or we end up with low back pain, or things like that. So the shock absorption part of our foot is really, really important for dancers because of the repetitive impact nature of dance. And then another function of our foot is proprioception. And so that is like our ability to balance and to interact and to react to our environment. And so we have tons of sensory nerve endings in our feet, and our feet tell us a lot about our environment. And so we want our foot to be able to give us good information from our surroundings and to have sort of high levels of proprioception. So all of these different functions, whether it be locomotion or whether it be shock absorption or whatever it is, are accomplished by the muscles and tendons and ligaments and nerves and neuromuscular feedback that is happening within the body. So it is an interplay of all of the different ways that our body interacts with movement. And so it is not dependent on one thing. And in this case, it is not dependent on our form necessarily. Our form does play some role in functioning for sure, but there's so much more than just the form. So it's not just the shape of our bones or just the plane of our joints or things like that. It then is also the muscles and the ligaments and the sensory system and the nervous system with like neuromuscular feedback and all of that type of stuff. So really, in dance, what we want to look at, or what we should be more concerned with, is the function of our feet. Are our feet functioning really, really well? Or are we just concerned about the form of them and like what they look like and that sort of like visual aesthetic of the foot? And so I'm much, much, much less interested in the form of the foot and very interested in the function of the foot because, like I said, form does not equal function. And so we want the function of our foot to be able to do all of the things that we need it to do by moving through the different planes of motion that the foot can move through. And so I think the easiest way for me to sort of like highlight what I'm talking about is by using a couple of like sort of case examples just of people I've seen in the clinic recently. And these are really, really common things that I see. So in the case of that young dancer that I was talking about, where the mom was really concerned about like, and I shouldn't even say she was concerned. It was a little bit of an offhanded comment where she just said, oh, like we're sort of steering her away from ballet. But this dancer loves ballet. Like it's her favorite style. And so yes, she does other styles as well, but she really loves ballet. But mom kind of sort of saying, oh, we're steering her away from that because she doesn't have the feet for it. So in this case, this dancer does have a very flat foot. And when she's standing, the form of her foot is quite flat. You don't see a lot of a medial arch. You don't see a lot of a transverse arch. She does have a fairly flat foot when she is standing. So I absolutely 100% understand where mom is coming from. I think the teachers have probably made similar comments with the flat foot and all of that kind of thing. But that doesn't tell us anything about the function of her foot. So we started to look at the function of her foot and look at, go beyond just what is the form of this foot. And what we found is that she has quite a lot of mobility in her foot. And so specifically in her ligaments, and she is on the more hypermobile side of things just generally throughout her body. Not extremely hypermobile, but certainly more towards the hypermobile side of the spectrum. And the same holds true for her foot. So she has a lot of mobility within her foot. So that means that the joints and the bones can actually move quite a lot, and they're quite malleable almost. And so because of that, when she stands and she's static and there's not a lot of muscular activity going on and she's just stood and she's relaxed, her foot really flattens out. And so the ligaments are able to stretch a little bit more, the bones are able to kind of like relax, and you end up with this sort of more flat-footed kind of form when we're looking at her. But when we ask her to do things dynamically, so I do like simple little tests, like I ask her to point her foot or to rise up onto demi-point, you can see that she actually has quite good function of her foot. So she actually has very, very good control of the intrinsic muscles of her feet. So she's able to control all the little tiny stabilizer muscles of the feet. And when she is pointing her foot, she's really working through the entire foot and actually actively controlling the movements that are happening. When she's rising up on demi-point, she's getting good recruitment and stability through all of the muscles and tendons that go into the foot. And so she can actually create a medial arch and a transverse arch. And you see the form of her foot change quite significantly when she goes from just standing in a relaxed state in a static position to when she's actually moving. So when she is pointing her feet or when she is dancing, she actually has a very, very, very functional foot and aesthetically a fairly, what we would call quote unquote desirable foot. There's nothing about her foot from a functional perspective that I would say is going to hold her back from, being able to progress to point work eventually if that's something she chooses to do or things like that. And so this is an example where, mom and maybe teacher, I don't actually know like what the conversations with her dance teachers have been, but there's just this sort of like preconceived notion of when you look at her feet, you're like, oh, they're really flat. This is just what she's stuck with. But when you actually watch her move and actually watch her dance, she has a very, very functional foot and one that will serve her really well. And again, because she's strong and because she's able to really recruit and use the small muscles of her feet really well, she's getting really good shock absorption and all of the things we look for when we're looking at the function of the foot. So this was an interesting case because I think it was a bit of a light bulb moment for mom to be like, oh, maybe this is not going to be a limiting factor for her in dance. And it was also a question mom sort of said like, oh, well, maybe we should get her orthotics because then maybe it will create an arch, and this sort of like idea that if we just like shove something with a built-in arch in the foot, it will create this arch for her. And in her case, because her foot is quite malleable and quite mobile, her foot, while she's standing on an orthotic, would have an arch, but it would not be created by anything actively. It would just be like a passive, sort of support in through there. But as soon as you take the orthotic away, she's going to go back to being flat-footed when she's standing because her foot just is really mobile. She has a lot of mobility in the joints in her foot, so it has the ability to shift kind of shape depending on what movement she's doing and what position she is in. So she is not a dancer who we would recommend anything like orthotics to. And really, the only recommendation in that case is just to continue to maintain the strength and the mobility and the intrinsic control and all of that stuff that she already demonstrates in her feet, just to continue with that because she's actually in a really good position from a, functional perspective. Her feet are quite functional for her. So that's one example of something that we commonly see when we're looking at like form versus function. Another example of this, and this is another dancer who I saw recently in the clinic, is a dancer coming in with a really, really naturally high arched foot, like a high instep, just like what a lot of other dancers would probably be maybe slightly envious of in terms of like the aesthetic of the foot. Like it looks like, that classic ballerina high arch sort of foot in through there. But she was coming in because she's getting a lot of foot pain and getting some shin splints, like pain kind of traveling up the inner side of the shins. And so coming in to like look at that issue. And in this case, from a form perspective, the foot sort of looks quote unquote ideal for dance. But from a functional perspective, her foot actually wasn't serving her very well at all. So she has this, like I said, very, very high instepped, high arched foot, but it is what we would call a more rigid foot. She does not have a lot of ability to allow the foot and the joints in the foot. So remember how we were saying there's 26 bones and 33 joints. Those 33 joints should have some amount of mobility in them. And some move more than others. Some are designed to be much more stable joints and others are designed to be much more mobile. but they should all have some amount of give in them. And especially the ones that are meant to be more mobile should have like a fair amount of give in them. And in this case of this dancer, she wasn't getting very much of any movement in a lot of different joints in that foot. So the foot is like this kind of rigid structure, which first of all is really, really gonna impact shock absorption. And so one of the things that we noticed with this foot is this rigidity, is that a word? Yeah, rigidity, this inability to sort of like move, and really specifically an inability for her foot to go into what we call a pronated position. And so I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of pronation because for a long time it got a bit of a bad rep. Like everybody became like a bit paranoid of pronation and, I overpronate and my foot shouldn't be pronating. And there was this like, I don't want to say obsession, but like a trend where pronation became something that the running shoe world, and maybe it started from the running world, I don't even know where it started from, but certainly from the shoe world, there was like this preoccupation with pronation. And so you could buy all these running shoes that were like pronation control shoes or anti-pronation and all of these things. But the reality is pronation. So that is our foot's ability. If we're thinking about that medial arch, it's sort of that medial arch being able to roll inwards is the easiest way to kind of try and describe pronation. It's easier to visualize than it is to try and describe. That movement that the foot can go into, that pronated movement, is a necessary movement for our foot to go through. And so, yes, there are some people who maybe collapse into that movement and can't control that movement, and that can be problematic. But everybody needs to be able to go through that movement. This idea of like, we shouldn't be pronating is false. We need to go through pronation. And the reason we need to go through pronation is because that is the shock absorbing part of our foot movements. And so if we're thinking about gait, like just walking, or it holds true for running and things as well, our foot actually goes through a variety of different movement patterns and on different movement planes, but we go from a more supinated position, so more towards the outside edge of our foot on heel strike, and then our foot rolls into this pronated position, so then there's more movement happening into that like medial rotation or coming through the medial side of the foot for shock absorption. That is the purpose of it, is shock absorption, and then we kind of resupinate before we push off. So while we are taking a step or when we're running or doing things like that, these movements should be happening and they should be well controlled. And so what we were seeing in this dancer who had this naturally really high but fairly rigid foot is that she was staying in that supinated position all the time, whether she was walking or jumping or even plieing, doing anything in dance, she was in this really supinated position and not getting any of the advantages or any of the benefit of allowing the foot to go through a pronated position to get that shock absorption. So although from a form perspective, it looks like her foot is sort of ideal for the dance world, from a functional perspective, her foot is not hugely functional and is creating other issues with lack of shock absorption and those types of things. When we dove into this more in terms of like, okay, what is going on? Like, what is causing this rigidity? What is causing this to not be able to like move well in through here or well in through like the arches of her foot or just through her midfoot area? We found that she was really, really over-dominant through some of the external muscles of the foot, so the muscles that come from the lower leg and then kind of come into the foot. She was really overusing some of those muscles and really not able to access a lot of the intrinsic muscles of the foot. So those are the smaller muscles that kind of start and end in the foot. They are more local muscles and they're really important for fine control of the foot and shock absorption and things like that. And so she had this imbalance of these muscles where the outer ones were working too hard and she wasn't able to access the inner ones. And that was creating a lot of tightness and a lot of this kind of like tension and rigidity in the foot. So that was certainly one thing that was contributing and something we see commonly, and actually something I'll probably end up doing a podcast episode on in the future, is really looking looking at that balance between intrinsic and extrinsic muscles. It's like more than what I want to dive into right now. So we had that going on. And then the other thing that we had going on as well was a little bit of like a psychological thing where she had, I don't actually know. I don't know if I asked her if she had been specifically told when she was younger or if it was just something that she had picked up in class of this idea of not rolling in. And so I think sometimes, especially when dancers are little, corrections that are given to one student in a class, they will often like internalize those corrections to themselves, even if those corrections don't apply. And we see this particularly with, sort of very type A personalities, perfectionist sort of tendencies. Those students are often listening to every single thing a teacher is saying in a classroom and taking on board every single correction. And in this case, there were obviously dancers in the class who were struggling with their feet rolling in or that overpronation. And so the teachers were talking about it or correcting it. And she had taken that on board, whether consciously or subconsciously, who knows, and so had really almost trained herself to keep her weight on the outer border of her foot, like her baby toe side of her foot, all the time. And so she had this form that already had these really, really high arches where she was already probably in a little bit more of a supinated position. And then functionally, she had trained herself on top of that to always stay in that position, never come out of that position, never allow the foot to move enough to come into any sort of like a pronated or more shock absorbing position. And so we can see how form and function aren't always directly correlated, but they can play into each other there. So it was an interesting conversation too, to sort of make her aware of this and try and then unlearn that habit that, like I said, I don't think I actually asked if the teacher specifically told her not to roll in or if it was more talking to other kids in the class. Just knowing what the structure and sort of form of her foot is, I suspect the teachers were probably talking to other kids in the class, but she had really taken this correction on board and become like very, very aware of keeping her weight on her baby toe or like the outer border of her foot at all time. So working on retraining that and like increasing the mobility in the foot to have less of a rigid foot, but then also allowing those more shock absorbing movements like pronation to happen is really important to increase the function of her foot. Because right now, although form wise, she has a very, very ideal foot for dance, functionally, it's really not serving her well at all. So hopefully those examples are helpful to you in terms of understanding a little bit how form does not always dictate function in dance. And really what we want to go after is function. So we can't always change the form of our foot. Sometimes with like prolonged training, and if we teach people how to access, the intrinsic muscles of their foot and things like that, we actually can make changes to the form of the foot. But I don't think that that should be the goal when we're looking at working with dancers' feet. The goal should always be to optimize function. And in the process, if the form changes, that might be a positive thing. But realistically, it is all about trying to get the foot functioning as best as we can for our dancers in through there. So again, like I said, I just wanted to clarify that because it's a topic sort of a topic that's been coming up in the clinic recently this week, where this idea of, dancers kind of striving for this ideal form and not really taking into account the function of the foot. And really what we want is to shift our focus to how our feet are functioning and pay less attention to the actual form of the foot. I hope that was helpful or informative or just, interesting to you. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that on the episode, please feel free to get in touch with me. All of my contact information is in the show notes. You can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika. I really appreciate you being here today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.